The first thing I saw was the line of black SUVs idling across my ranch gate. 14 private guards stood shoulder to shoulder in the heat, blocking the only road to my property like they owned the place. One of them rested a hand on his vest, while another tapped my gate with a flashlight, not even trying to hide the smirk on his face. I could hear my horse kicking the fence behind me, the low buzz of a drone somewhere overhead, and my own heartbeat pounding so hard it felt like it was in my throat. Then the man in the center stepped forward, held up a clipboard, and said the words that made my hands go cold. "You are not entering this property today. My ranch had been in my family for 40 years. It sat on the edge of the county. 20 acres of pasture, old oak trees, and a red barn my father and I rebuilt board by board after a storm tore half the roof off. I had spent years fixing fence lines, digging drainage trenches, and fighting off every small piece of neglect this land could throw at me. That wasn't just land to me. It was memory, work, and every dollar I had managed to save after my wife passed and left me raising our daughter alone." The HOA had moved into the area 6 years earlier when developers bought up the surrounding acreage and turned it into a rural luxury community. That was their phrase, not mine. They promised privacy, order, and shared stewardship. What they really built was a board full of people who acted like the rest of us were temporary guests on their private kingdom. The president was a very sharp-faced man named Richard Vance, the kind of guy who always spoke softly and never smiled with his eyes. He had polished boots, perfect teeth, and a habit of waving legal papers like he had written the law himself. The first warning came 8 weeks before the standoff. I found a notice on my gate claiming my ranch road was community access property and that the board was reviewing unauthorized usage of easement land. I simply laughed at first because I had the deed, the survey, the county records, and 3 separate title documents that said the exact same thing. My road, my fence, my land. But then the notices kept coming. First, a violation letter, then a fine, then a demand that I remove my obstructive barriers or face enforcement. They were trying to rewrite history in real time, and they were doing it with a smile. I called their management office and asked for the recorded easement agreement. They sent me a 1-page PDF with no signatures. I asked for the board meeting minutes approving the access claim. They sent me a bill. I asked for the county filing. They sent me another. Fine entirely. That's when I knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a strategy. Still, even then, I didn't think they were reckless enough to send private guards to my gate and physically block me from entering my own ranch. I didn't know they were willing to cross that line. I didn't know they were already in too deep. And I definitely didn't know that one document in my truck would turn their whole operation upside down. The first big move came on a Wednesday morning when I was hauling hay into the south barn. A certified letter was taped to my trailer door, sealed in red ink, threatening daily penalties if I did not cease interfering with association access rights. It also claimed I was trespassing by closing the West Drive, which was absurd because the West Drive ended at my livestock gate and never belonged to the HOA in the first place. I called my attorney that same day and he told me to gather everything: deeds, surveys, tax records, old utility maps, and every notice they had ever sent. I spent the next 2 days doing exactly that. By nightfall, I had a table covered in big binders, copies, highlighted plats, and county stamps. The more I looked, the more ridiculous the HOA's claim became. Their easement didn't exist in any official county filing. Their letter referred to a parcel number that had been retired 9 years earlier. Worst of all, their own management company had been billing the neighborhood for security patrol expansion across land they did not control. Sent the board a calm, formal reply. I listed the legal defects in their notice, attached proof of ownership, and demanded they stop sending agents onto my property. I even offered to meet them at the county recorder's office so we could clear it up face-to-face properly. For most people, that would have been the end of it. But Richard Vance took my letter as a challenge. 3 days later, I found orange survey flags along my north fence. Not on the community side, on my side. Then a crew showed up with measuring wheels and a drone, claiming they were verifying boundary compliance. I walked out with my property packet in hand and asked who hired them. The foreman said the HOA had authorized a temporary boundary review. I asked to see the authorization. He hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. They weren't verifying anything. They were building a paper trail to support a lie. The second move was worse. The board sent a cease and desist order accusing me of threatening security staff and obstructing contracted patrol operations. It was so obviously inflated that I almost laughed. But this time, there was a new twist. Buried inside the packet was a map showing my ranch road as a shared ingress route, and under it, a handwritten note referencing a county development file I had never seen before. I pulled the file myself from the archives the next morning. That's when I found the thing the board never expected me to find. The developer's original plat had been amended after the HOA formed, and the amendment had been filed under a different project name to hide the transfer of access rights. But the amendment contained one fatal problem. The signature approving the change was from a former board member who had resigned before the filing date. In other words, the HOA had built its entire claim on a document signed by someone who had no authority to sign it. That was the moment the balance shifted. They weren't just wrong, they were exposed. I called my attorney back immediately, and this time his tone changed entirely. He told me to stop talking to the board directly and let him handle the next move. He also told me to keep every guard encounter on video. Because once an HOA starts using private security to interfere with property access, the conversation stops being about dues and starts becoming about liability. So I did something Richard Vance never expected. I invited them to a meeting at the county office, not the HOA clubhouse. I told them to bring every document supporting their access claim. I also copied the county recorder, the sheriff's office, and the state attorney's Consumer Protection Division. If they wanted to keep pretending this was a routine enforcement matter, I was going to make sure every official in the county watched them do it. When the day came, 3 board members arrived with their lawyer. 2 security supervisors and Richard Vance, looking like he had already rehearsed his speech in the mirror. The guards stood outside the conference room, arms crossed, as if they were there to intimidate me one last time. I placed my deed on the table, then the survey, then the amended plat, then the archived county filing showing the authority problem. Richard barely glanced at the papers before saying the HOA had interpreted the documents in good faith. That was his mistake. My lawyer slid forward a copy of the recorded amendment with the invalid signature highlighted in yellow. He explained, very politely, that the HOA had been enforcing access rights based on a void filing. Then he produced the billing records showing that the association had charged residents for private security patrols on my land without legal authorization. The room went dead silent. And right there, with the boards suddenly realizing the ground had vanished under them, I want to pause for a second, because stories like this are exactly why people keep coming back to these videos. Not just for the drama, but for the moment when someone who's been pushed too far finally stands up with facts, nerve, and patience. If you enjoy watching bullies get exposed and real power get tested, hit like and subscribe to HO Neighbor right now, because what happened when the county officer walked in next changed everything fast. The county compliance officer had been copied on the meeting, and he arrived with a file thick enough to make Richard's face drain of color. He asked one question first. Who approved security personnel to block a private landowner from entering his property? Nobody answered. Then he asked for the legal basis for the HOA's access claim. Richard tried to speak, but the officer cut him off and requested the recorded filing number. The board's lawyer looked down at the table like he wanted to disappear. The officer reviewed the amendment, checked the signatures, then looked directly at the board and said the filing was invalid on its face. He also announced that using private guards to interfere with lawful access raised serious issues of trespass, false imprisonment, and unlawful collection of association funds. That was the moment I knew the board had lost control. Not because I yelled, not because I threatened them, because their own paper trail had finally been read by someone who understood what it meant. The resolution came fast after that. Within 72 hours, the HOA was forced to stand down from every enforcement action against my ranch. The private guards were removed from the property. The access notices were rescinded. And the county opened an inquiry into how the association had used avoid filing directly to justify patrols and penalties. Several residents came forward after hearing what had happened, and that's when the bigger pictures started to emerge. My case wasn't the only problem. It was just the one that finally made people look closely. The board's financial records were audited, and the results were ugly. Security spending had been hidden across multiple line items. Maintenance fees had been diverted into consulting charges tied to all companies connected to board insiders. The same men who had tried to tell me I was trespassing on my own land had been billing their neighbors for years under false assumptions and misleading records. Once the county started asking questions, the board began collapsing from the inside. One member resigned. Then another. Richard Vance tried to fight the findings, but the invalid filing and unauthorized security deployment were impossible to just explain away. As for the FBI, they were brought in after the county uncovered evidence that the board had been using falsified records and coordinated intimidation to pressure owners into surrendering disputed access rights. By then, the case had grown beyond a neighborhood fight. It had become a fraud investigation. The arrests came on a Friday morning, and I watched the news from my porch, while the same gate they had blocked for me finally swung open without a single guard in sight. The board was dissolved soon after, and the management contract was terminated. What stayed with me most wasn't the handcuffs or the headlines. It was the quiet that came after it. For the first time in months, I could walk my own fence line without a stranger demanding papers for land I had paid for, maintained, and defended. I stood by the barn my father and I rebuilt and realized the victory wasn't just legal. It was personal. They had tried to turn ownership into a question mark. In the end, the records answered for me. Before you leave this one behind, I want to ask you something specific. Have you ever seen a group in power push so hard that they accidentally expose their own fraud? Put your experience in the comments, because I read those stories closely. And if you want the follow-up on what happened when the former board members tried to blame the security company, that next chapter is worth seeing. Make sure to hit that subscribe button to HO Drama Neighbor so you never miss an update. Drop your thoughts down below, and I will see you next time.